This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Okay, welcome back to the first of our parallel sessions this morning, or to the first set of parallel sessions this morning. So this is Epigenetics and New Perspectives of Inheritance. You've got the biographies of all speakers in your conference pack, so we're just going for minimal introductions here, and we're going to take questions at the end. So I'm going to introduce first Clare Hanson, who's in English at Southampton, and Clare is going to give a paper entitled Reconfiguring Inheritance, Red Dust Road as a Post-Genomic Text. Clare.
Thank you, Gill. Can you hear me? Is this working? Yeah, cool, good, okay. This is reading Jackie Kay's recent memoir, which I know there was another paper which I had to miss yesterday. I'm sorry about that because I was chairing a session. I'd like to kind of see how these papers fitted together. But as many of you will know, Jackie Kay was born to a Scottish mother, a Nigerian father, and was adopted by white working class Glaswegians, whom she describes as great humanitarians. It's a wonderful kind of evocation of all her parents. So she was adopted when she was about 5 months old. And this memoir, Red Dust Road, reflects on her search for her birth parents. A quest for origins, which is initially articulated in the familiar language of genes and blood. But as Kay's narrative unfolds, it runs up against the limits of the explanatory power of genetics and strikes out to shape an ontology which resonates with the insights that are coming from epigenetic science. Recent research in epigenetics has shown, or should I say, suggests, that identity is not formed by a template which is fixed before birth, but is shifting and dynamic, produced through continuous interactions between the individual and their environment. In biological terms, it's construed into terms of plasticity, a concept which also has philosophical implications, which have been explored recently by Catherine Malabou, who has written a number of books exploring philosophical plasticity, and also conjoining this with neuroscience. And she argues that neuronal plasticity, in particular, generates a view of the individual as a self-sculpting organism. And she's mapped the congruences between the plasticity of the brain and the possibility of fashioning by memory one's own history. So this paper, and this is part of a longer piece, the paper as a whole reads the history that Kay shapes in her memoir through the lenses of both biological and philosophical meanings of plasticity, and explores the way in which, in intertwining these perspectives, Kay's memoir draws out some of the imbrications of ontogeny and ontology. And now I go on to the science part, Epigenetic research. Now, the prefix epi means on or around. So as this suggests, it's concerned with mechanisms around the gene. And it has called, really, I think the jury's out on this. Has it overturned the genetic paradigm, or has it at least seriously complicated it? That's kind of still being debated. But it certainly calls in question the central dogma of 20th century genetics, as Crick called it, unfortunate choice of terms, I think, on his part, revealing, causation running in a single direction from DNA to RNA to protein, the kind of coding model of causation, all one way. Epigenetics, in contrast, stresses the dynamic interaction of all the components of the cell from the very first moment of fertilization. It's this interaction, of course, which explains the fact that although every cell of our body has the same DNA, cells diverge remarkably in the course of our original development. So some cells become liver cells, some become epithelial cells, and so on. They become differentiated. And this differentiation occurs as elements of the surrounding cell's soma act on the DNA, on the genome, modifying the expression of DNA through an array of complex processes, including gene methylation, histone modification, and the operation of small, non-coding RNAs. Epigenetics, therefore, provides an understanding of development in which a model of genetic predeterminism, one way, and with genes as the primary cause, is replaced by that of a dynamic system involving an infinitely complex network of pathways and nodes of transfer. And this insight has been captured famously by the metaphor of the epigenetic landscape, which was first proposed in 1953 by the developmental biologist C.H. Waddington. There's a picture which, had I had more time, I would have a fascinating picture of the epigenetic landscape for you to look at. It is interesting. He's thinking about the ways in which he's thinking about the differential patterning of a landscape, steep valleys and shallow valleys, and the way in which the steep valleys tend to fix characteristics. He has a word for this called canalization. And shallow valleys are open to the contingency of a change in direction. So he's trying to capture and express the sense of development taking place in terms of processes which are dynamic, and their balance between stability and change, between predictability and the contingent. Research in epigenetics is also transforming our understanding of the relationship between organisms and their environments, demonstrating that there is a close and continuous process of interchange between the two. And this interdependence is evident from the very earliest stages of development in the crosstalk between DNA and its intracellular environment. And Evelyn Fox Keller describes this crosstalk, this interplay, through a multidimensional metaphor, describing these interactions as complex and entangled, involving causal influences that extend upward, downward, and sideways. I'm very interested in the way in which linearity is disrupted in that metaphor. Simultaneity is foregrounded. As the fetus develops, it also responds to cues from the maternal body, which in turn reflect pressures which are coming from her external environment. There's a very famous example of this, which is the Dutch hunger winter, 1944-45, when women who were starved gave birth to smaller babies, and they carried the memory of this deprivation, an epigenetic memory, leading to an increased risk of cardiovascular disease. And that's a very long-term and very large-scale epidemiological study. And of course, after birth too, we continue to be sensitive, extremely sensitive to environmental triggers, particularly during periods of rapid growth, which of course are the ones that pertain to motherhood, pregnancy, early life, and adolescence. Or perhaps adolescence, I don't know, you can argue the toss with that one. Anyway, there's a very well-known example which has been much mobilised in popular science, the discovery that maternal licking and grooming of rat pups has effects on stress levels regulated epigenetically. More recently, there are findings that the experience of childhood abuse has effects which are mediated by neuronal epigenetic changes. So epigenetics is uncovering, finding evidence for, be careful here, specific mechanisms by means of which the external environment can, as it were, get under the skin, pointing to the existence of what Hochberg has called an epigenetic link between nature and nurture. And this is obviously a fascinating proposition, which you can, I'm sure, think of all the kind of possible complications and cautions that one might have in kind of exploring this, but it is fascinating. The idea that genes are the drivers of inheritance, the drivers of the things that form our identity, somatic and psychic, has become so deeply embedded in our culture, and perhaps in our country too, actually. I think it's definitely Western, it's definitely not Russia. That's another story. Okay, it's so deeply rooted in our culture, and I think it's also, it's kind of naturalised in a lot of literary texts. It's become, literature works to kind of naturalise these ideas. But Kay's memoir is fascinating because she invokes the genetic imaginary and its power for her as an adopted child, but then it's called into question through her representation of the affective disjunctions which mark and mar her encounters with her birth parents. And she comes to these encounters, of course, with the widely shared assumption that individuals who are related by blood or genes have similar traits which in turn construct, create, generate natural or instinctive affinities. And this is not what epigenetics would suggest. Epigenetics would suggest, in contrast, that we should attach less weight to genetic ties because, as I've tried to explain, what makes us, quotes, who we are is not just our DNA, by no means, but what happens to it in the complex contingencies of development. And it's this combination of complexity and contingency that means that even those who share the same DNA sequence, that is, blood relations, will develop into markedly different individuals. And someone who's done some work on this is Tim Spector at King's College. He's had a very successful book called Identically Different, popular science book. He's a very charming person. He's done lots of epidemiological studies long-term on twins and has shown they're very unlikely to have similar life courses or to have similar diseases, which of course you would predict and has been predicted for decades from thinking about DNA and about the determining power of DNA. And he also points out the kind of way, well, he's making a kind of biological argument about we're misled into assuming that identical twins are alike in character because they look the same. They do indeed look the same. This is true. But he points out that this is it's a kind of false trail because human beings are very sensitive to picking up these visual cues, mannerisms, and facial expressions. And in line with Spector's point here, I think, when Kay first meets her birth parents, the question of physical resemblance is her most pressing concern. Like many adopted children, she sets out to find her birth parents when she's expecting a baby. And the doctors keep asking her about what diseases run in her family, what are the lines, all these kind of metaphors of genes, lines, and blood come into the text. And she has to say she doesn't know because she's adopted. Her pregnancy makes her feel that she's no longer alone, but the questions exacerbate her feelings of rootlessness. But interestingly, this dialectic of ambivalence is replayed when she meets her birth mother. She's touched by the fact that she and Elizabeth, her mother, each bring orchids to the meeting. Actually, in parentheses, I wonder if that fact has anything to do with genetics, close parentheses. But she's taken aback by the lack of any physical similarity between them. And this absence creates a profound sense of disorientation. No matter how hard she stares, she can't see anything of my face in hers. And in consequence, the meeting takes on this quality of a fake. She writes, there's an uncomfortable intimacy between us. The knowledge that we're biologically mother and daughter makes me feel a little bit like a fraud, which is a really kind of interesting observation. Her first meeting with her birth father is equally disorienting, though, despite or because in him she finds the physical resemblances she was searching for. So these similarities, paradoxically, are equally disorienting. Her father's physical presence seems to cancel her out, rendering her insubstantial and ghost-like. And Kay notes that the ordinary fact of resemblance that most people take for granted is spooky and strange for an adopted person. And this choice of words suggests, I think, that for an adopted child, physical resemblances are uncanny in the Freudian sense because they unravel a sense of possessing a unique identity, a unique and bounded subjectivity. So in Red Dust Rose, the encounters with both parents, I suggest, work to kind of unravel rather than endorse the mythology that surrounds the idea of genetic ties. How am I doing for time?
It's fine.
Yeah. Well, okay. So Kay writes, thanks. The whole business of being adopted seems on the one level to be a fantastic fiction. Something about it, even to you, seems fake. Anybody could be sitting there saying they are your mother or father. You could be anybody claiming to be his or her daughter. Yes, on some level it seems fabulously made up, as attractive as an idea as it is revolting that this total stranger sitting next to you should be related to you by blood. I'm very interested in this idea of revulsion, but I won't kind of move on to that at this point. It's linked, I think, to the uncanny. So, Kay problematises the idea of blood relationships, but at the same time I think she suggests new ways of thinking about embodied connections and biological ties. The idea that a total stranger should be recognised as an intimate relation excuse me, is an affront to experiential knowledge. And folded into this insight is the intuition that biological connections do not pre-exist experience as genes were once thought to do, but are forged in and through the processes of life. Now, there's another section now on from nurture to nature, signatures and memories. The idea that genes can interact with the environment is as old as genetics itself, but it's only recently that research in epigenetics has begun to uncover the mechanisms of this interaction, as evidence is being accumulated for connections between specific patterns of gene expression, known as epigenetic signatures, specific environmental triggers, and the resulting characteristics of an individual. So it's the construction of a kind of pathway by association, and there are all kinds of reservations one might have about that, but there are an awful millions, zillions of pounds are going into this. It's a major kind of field of research. Most of the research focuses, for obvious enough reasons, on early life adversity because of developmental plasticity, because of the sensitivity of the organism during development. And early life adversity has been shown to have lifelong effects on physical and mental health. In relation to physical health, it's been found that if you have an unbalanced diet in pregnancy, it can lead to changes in the methylation of genes involved in the development of the pancreas, etc., etc. Obesogenic mothers, Ruth will tell you all about it. And there are political questions to be asked about this, which Ruth asks, which is great. Okay, so the offspring of these mothers, if they have an unbalanced diet of a particular kind, are at risk of type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease again. I've mentioned the licking and grooming of rats, which people I know in epigenetics say it's not a terribly good paper, but it's gained this enormous cultural traction, which is kind of interesting in itself. But this is about methylation levels on the glucocorticoid receptor gene, which a marker is demethylated, and stress responses are either raised or lowered. And this is in rats. Obviously, quite apart from ethical issues, there are huge methodological problems in this whole process of translating across from animal studies to humans. But there has recently been a large-scale human study that's found epigenetic changes on the glucocorticoid receptor gene in association with specific psychosocial stresses. Now, this line of inquiry, this kind of research, raises, I think, a number of important questions. Might it be possible, for example, to identify specific parenting behaviours in humans which alter gene methylation and promote high or low levels of stress in children? Might other aspects of early nurture, breastfeeding, for example, leave epigenetic signatures under the skin? Now, these questions are not mine. They're not a kind of nightmare scenario dreamt up by me from my kind of obsession with eugenics. These issues are a matter of hot debate. They're hot topics among biologists and among social scientists. And there's recently been a call from the ESRC and the BBSRC for research in this area, trying to find markers for social, for social sociopathologies, really, I think. Anyway. Just say a little bit more about. I'll just do K. Yeah, that's fine. I'll just do a little bit more on K and then I'll shut up. I haven't got very far. Okay, a little bit of just exploring the way in which Kay's text kind of very interestingly kind of registers these possibilities. It is fascinating. Kay's account of her own origins, it comes first from her adoptive mother. And she describes the process in terms that mirror the stories of kinning, analysed by, I think it's Senior Howell, who gave a paper out as part of the network that Gill has been running, which was extremely interesting. In her study of transnational adoption in Norway, Howell suggests that the process of adoption involves the construction of a symbolic pregnancy and birth. She describes the pregnancy as beginning when the couple first decides to register with an adoption agency. It can be a very long pregnancy, 2 years. It involves creating emotional space for the anticipated child with all the ambivalences within that. Birthing starts as soon as a child's been allocated, and the child is introduced into the social circle, the family, as photographs and information, bits and pieces about them are kind of circulated among family and friends. And something very similar happens with Kay's mother, her adoptive mother, who kind of shadows her birth mother in her imagination, and this is how Kay describes it. Months before my birth mother gave birth to me, my mum knew that she was going to have me. Quotes, "It was the closest I could get to giving birth myself," she's told me often. Quote again, "I didn't know if I had have a girl or a boy, if you'd be healthy or not, the kind of thing that no mother knows. It was a real experience. It felt real. I remember waiting and waiting for news of your birth and phoning up every day to find out if you'd been born yet." But when Kay is born, she's not healthy. She's been injured by forceps, she's thought to have brain damage, and she's not expected to live. And her adoptive mother is told to, quote, "pick another baby." But she refuses to do that because, and this is all Kay's narrative, she's become attached to the idea of me. So far in Kay's story, which is of course the story of her adoptive mother's story, the connection between mother and daughter is framed as a purely social relationship. But from this point on, a link is posited between biology and culture, as Kay speculates that the affective bond between them is responsible for the fact that she thrives unexpectedly in the first months of her life. And this is the quotation. "My mother visited every week or every month, depending when she's telling the story, driving the 40 miles from Glasgow to Edinburgh with my dad, and she had to wear a mask so as not to infect me, and got to pick me up and hold me. Perhaps this interest, this love, is what made me survive against the odds. The doctors were apparently amazed at my recovery." So, where Howell's study found that adoptive parents start from a focus on biology as the model which underwrites the notion of a normative family, but end up utterly rejecting that and proposing, quotes, "a rather assertive culturalist approach to reproduction and the construction of the family." Kay's story has a different narrative arc. She doesn't privilege the social or the cultural over the biological aspects of kinship or connectedness. And the narrative that Kay and her adoptive mother shape is sensitive to the variety, the diversity of the factors that shape our identity, and the complex, very complex interplay between social meanings and somatic experience. As I've shown, in particular, Kay highlights the importance of the care, nurture she receives from her adoptive mother from the beginning. And she dramatises the way in which this nurture becomes her nature. Becomes her nature in the sense of both soma and psyche. And Kay kind of continues to kind of destabilise the relationship or to problematise the line between biology and culture. She kind of describes her relationship with her adoptive mother. She speaks about inheriting her qualities of imagination and speech and so on, which of course, as she says, is perhaps the right word. It's not necessarily a paradoxical statement, because from an epigenetic perspective, if the nurture received in early life does get under the skin, you can argue that a socio-biological connection is thereby forged between whoever is caring for the child and the child. And Kay's memoir supports this suggestion, which I think opens up a number of really important questions about how we might want to reconceptualise numerous aspects of motherhood, but I'll just keep the focus narrow here, particularly how we conceptualise the role of adoptive parents and, of course, foster parents as well. I'll stop there. Thank you.
It takes a while, doesn't it? Here we go. Is this your...
Yeah, it's on here.
Good.
I imagine it'll come on there. Right, well, thank you.
Sorry, I'll just introduce you, Gabriele, rather than making you introduce yourself. Thank you very much, Claire. And we go straight on to Gabriele Griffin's paper. And Gabriele is in Women's Studies at York. and her title is Identity Matters, Donor Offsprings, Narratives of Self and Their Implications for Epigenetic Debate Thing.
You'll see that a little extra bit has crept in, Erasing Mother, which has come because of a particular trail I've been following since I first had did the abstract, so you'll have to bear with me on this. I'm very grateful to Clare, who's done a lot of the science work, so I shan't be doing it, although I'm talking in the same terrain, as you'll see very quickly. Now, many of you will remember then when Louise Brown, the first so-called test tube baby, was born, feminists immediately raised the question of creation envy or womb envy and of the erasure of the mother from the reproductive process. And a lot of that centered on the first published photos, if you remember. This is a doctored one, and I have no time to go into it, but there's something very interesting about what has happened to the photography around Louise Brown since she first came out, so to speak. Now, many of you may also remember test tube women. Here we are. Though perhaps less the subtitle of it, What Future for Motherhood, which came out 6 years later in 1984 and was in part a response to the concerns feminists had about test tube babies. Now, 10 years later, sorry, I'm moving on quickly. Rosie Bridotti's Nomadic Subjects came out. Now, this text is never mentioned in this particular context, but it contains a very interesting essay titled Mothers, Monsters and Machines. In that text, where she dialogues with Donna Haraway's work, she restates the anxiety about the erasure of the mother from the procreative process. She's concerned with what she describes a new figuration of feminist subjectivity, and she posits that there is a certain political urgency to address the figuration of the mother, monster and machine at a time when, as she puts it, power over the body has reached an implosive peak. She regarded what she described as the mechanization of the maternal function as an articulation of the phallogocentric fantasy of self-creation, where difference, here interestingly read as the monstrous, that which is objected, the feminine, is eradicated, partly, one, through the removal of the maternal from the procreative process, supposedly, and partly through the establishment of new visualization techniques, such as improvised ultrasound and so on, that allow for the selection of reproductive material, viable eggs, that word viable, which didn't used to be around, sperm, viable embryos, viable fetuses and so on, in such a way as to, on the one hand, install new normativities, i.e. definitions of what constitutes the viable in reproductive terms, and on the other hand, erase the monstrous or the different, that which doesn't fit into this norm. Now, anxieties about the erasure of the mother from the procreative process in the 1980s and early 1990s came out of a very particular political moment that I think we need to remember. Broadly, the 1980s were about women claiming space, actual and symbolic, for themselves and demanding bodily autonomy from a position of woman-centeredness. Terribly old-fashioned now to use that phrase, but actually that's what one has to remember. And also importantly, in juxtaposition to a history of a sense of subordination to the control of men. These were really important strands that informed those positions. The difference politics that took over from identity politics in the 1990s signaled both differentiation among women and, importantly, created the gaps between them into which men, if you like, seemed to re-emerge or to re-arrive, not least via the new biotechnologies. It was as if women's hard-won territory, women's space of their own, was being retaken. That is why there was such a reaction to those photos of Louise Brown. And it was, in part, a reaction against this, that some feminists reasserted both the importance of the female subject, that's why Bridotti is writing about that, and the importance of women's retention of control over at least some of the reproductive process. As such, this position doesn't really engage with questions such as women who could not, as Jackie Cates puts it, do that incredible natural thing. You remember that line, the irony of that line, of becoming pregnant and giving birth. But for such women, i.e. women who cannot become pregnant, the maternal, understood as biological motherhood, was not readily achievable, and their relation to IVF, for example, was not necessarily permeated by the fears expressed either in test tube women or in the Mother's Monsters machine essay of Bredotis. Okay, nearly 20 years on from this, i.e. 1994, when that text came out, I want to look at the erasure of the mother from a different, though in some ways related, angle. And this isn't totally formulated out, as you'll see. My focus here are donor offspring and their narratives of self for the generations who were conceived with the aid of the new reproductive technologies in the 1980s and 1990s. Have come or are coming of age, and increasingly have published accounts of their perceptions of their origins. These accounts raise very interesting questions about how they understand their origins, not least in the lights of the developments over the past 15 years or so in the field of epigenetics. Now, first, I just want to highlight the fact that in common with the text I've just talked about, i.e. test tube women and nomadic subjects, much of the research on donor conception done to date, particularly in the social sciences, has focused on the prospective parents and their experiences and expectations. This contrasts very interestingly, in my view, with what one might broadly describe as the cultural production of this issue, fiction, film, poetry, and so on, which has tended to depict the offspring's reaction to questions of mainly his, but sometimes her, sense of origin. In a broad sense, you see these things. You know, we think of Frankenstein, mechanical dolls, all these very different children of divergent creative processes. And there's a long tradition in culture of this. We can't go into this now. The general point I want to make, though, is that there is this long tradition of culturally constructed narratives that center on the reaction of the offspring produced by divergent means to that unchosen condition of their life, to use Judith Butler's phrase. And indeed, as a donor offspring writing in a donor sibling registry said, I would like to remind members of this registry that it is not just the parents of donor-inseminated offspring that are here, i.e. on this website. There are also adult donor-conceived people present. Some of us are actively looking for our biological relations. Now, my interest in the issue of donor offspring's narratives of self is part of a larger project dealing with the question of how people with non-normative identities produce narratives about their origin. Having such a narrative available is critical both in one's daily life and for one's sense of self. And Claire has already referred to Jackie Kay saying, I don't know my medical history because I'm adopted. And that's a classic example of that kind of problematic of what happens when you don't have a ready narrative to tell. We're endlessly, repeatedly, and continuously asked to account for ourselves, to provide narratives of self so that we may be placed in the socio-cultural order. And indeed, a whole literary genre, the Bildungsroman, is actually devoted to precisely that phenomenon. Okay. Now, one of the underlying, unquestioning assumptions is that a ready answer is available and that the answer will make sense to the listener. But, A, an answer may not be readily available, nor may the answer be well received, particularly when one's identity does not fit the dominant norm of how that narration should proceed. There are many identities that don't fit those norms, one of which is donor-conceived people. And this has led Amanda Turner and Adrian Coyle to suggest that one of the functions of counseling and therapy for families using donor insemination might be, and I quote, to facilitate clients in constructing a DI family narrative. Katie Russell-Young, a donor-conceived woman, who said that my whole life I've had to explain my family to everyone who didn't get it, tells this story. A kid asked why my daddy never came to pick me up. No, daddy, I said, 2 mummies. They're both my mums. And yes, I call both mum. I'm 28, and that's still the question I get asked the most. The fact that Ruth so young was required again and again to explain her family is a function of certain pervasive normative assumptions about familial origin, namely that all children have one father and one mother. The norms of intelligibility that govern narratives of origin assume a father and a mother, not multiple parents of different orders. Having the possibility of donor insemination, egg donation, surrogacy, gestational parenting, and embryo adoption create a situation where, as Diane Ehrenreich has put it, and this has come out the wrong way, never mind, if we cannot even get into focus the reality of a child with up to 5 parents, sperm donor, egg donor, gestational carrier, legal parents, how are we to fathom a child who has 3 genetic parents or only 1 genetic parent, or might be his own grandpa? Note the emphasis on genetic here. As a result of the biotechnological developments Ehrensaft references, the literature on divergently conceived families, as far as the parent generation is concerned, abounds with adjectives listed there to specify the nature of the parental relation to the child, including real, biological, social, genetic, gestational, surrogate, and so on. And I'm sure more will follow. But such terminology is not readily available to the donor-conceived child. Writing about the issue of being asked, so is he your father? Katie Russo says, no, he's my donor. I remember running out of language at times. Fine, he's my dad. But so he is. She's my mum. And so she is. I remember that redefining language in a world that doesn't want it redefined was so challenging for a kid who needed it changed right away. I remember how that was used against me, against us. Such descriptions of the failure of language and existing familial categorizations to name relations are very common in narratives of donor offspring, and I use Rousseau-Young's story here simply as a shorthand. But they're only the first stage of the issues raised by these questions of classification. For underlying them are questions about relation that reference biology and genetics. And to manage these questions, in Katie Russo's family, where we had a lesbian couple with 2 daughters conceived by different known donors, they had what they called family policy. And that was, no one is to know who is biologically related. We got asked that question quite frequently. Whose is whose? Who cares? It's not your business. Biology was not to play a role. Now, despite the mother's best efforts, however, biology did come to play a role in this, as indeed in most other instances, when questions of connection become articulated. Here, what happened was that the sperm donors decided they wanted to assert parental rights. And parental rights were asserted on the basis of biological connection. So they couldn't actually escape it. Now, while Rousseau-Young's mothers had used known donors, many heterosexual, but also some gay and lesbian couples, as well as single mothers, opt for anonymous donation. And indeed, until the 1990s, when the legislation in fact in only a very few countries, changed, most donation was anonymous, with few records kept. Hence, by the 2000s, there are quite a few web sites, online networks, and registries devoted to people looking for the donors whose offspring they were, which for the most part still means, and this is sort of gradually changing now, offspring looking for their fathers. The desires which prompt that search are fueled quite prominently by what Donna Haraway describes in many ways as a genetic fiction, a fantasy that, and Claire's been talking about that, a fantasy that biological connection equals emotional connection, as well as providing not even an, but the explanation for the self. Where donor conception remains a family secret, disclosure is often quite problematic, and it can be difficult to deal with. One woman described this as follows. Following the mother's indication that there's something about your past you need to know. So sort of, edging forward towards revelation. When my mother reached 70, I sent her a birthday card with a letter promising never to bother her again if she could just tell me the truth about the secret. In a cold, stark letter, she bade me appreciate that it had been very difficult for her to write. She told me that she'd gone to Exeter for artificial insemination by donor. The bare facts were hideously opposed to anything I'd ever believed in. Now, this woman believed in the romance of the genetic family, where babies are the natural progression of mutually fulfilling heterosexual adult relationships, only to find that her genesis was a result of, as she put it, a verbal contract, a financial transaction, and a cold clinical harnessing of medical technology. So there's this sort of fantasy of what might happen, how you might become a baby, and then this stuff, terrible. Having been deprived of her fantasy of the romance of hetero fulfillment through procreation, she resorted to another one about her donor parent, which served both to explain her differences from the parents who had brought her up and to grant her a new identity. It was actually satisfying to discover that I'd been absolutely right to question my identity. I really was somebody else. Half of my ancestry had been signed away, and the loss of my true identity was the price I paid for my parents' reproductive compromise of using donor insemination. Now, this narrative both reproduces the notion of identity as genetic composition, with 50% coming from one and 50% from the other parent, and, importantly, as a function of the discovery of being donor conceived, the genetic parent who brought up the child, in other words, the mother, because remember there is a genetic parent still present here, and her genes are typically devalued in favor of an overinvestment in the absent genetic parent who is endowed with only desirable traits. This fantasy then leads to the search for this idealized donor parent. Here we have a very different but equally important erasure of the mother from the procreative scene. Given her donor insemination, she becomes devalued, and that despite the genetic connection that she has to this daughter. Now, of course, this doesn't automatically have to be the case. Nonetheless, the purposive search that donor offspring engage in to find their biological or genetic parent is strongly related to how they interpret the meaning of inheritance. John Berger quotes a typical example of a man called Ryan, who said about himself, "When I look in the mirror, discover something new, a new interest I had, new talent or something like that, I could always relate what I had in common with my maternal side of the family. But on the other side of it, there were all these characteristics that I noticed about myself that obviously didn't come from my mum's side of the family. And always, my curiosity was driven by wanting to see the source of all those parts of myself in somebody else." The issue is here that these donor-conceived offspring think of themselves as in certain ways biologically programmed and consider their biological inheritance key to who they are. Ryan, the person here, is both explicit and expansive about this. Any new interest or talent seemingly that he cannot or is not able to readily attribute to his mother's side of the family, he assumes to be derived directly from his mother's side. The subtext here is that from his father's side. The subtext here is that genetic inheritance is simply central to one's understanding of self. Now, all of this has, of course, been unsettled, as Clare's paper beautifully illustrated, by the arrival of epigenetics, the study of the ways in which all manner of non-genetic or environmental factors, both internal and external, act upon genes to change their articulation, to modify their articulation. Tabitha Powledge defines epigenetics of the study of mechanisms that change gene expression by modifying DNA without modifying its sequences of bases, and this very standard definition. Margaret Locke, interestingly, suggests that shifts in molecular biology which have prompted this study of epigenetics have led to what she calls the dethroning of the gene. But such dethroning is not particularly evident in donor offspring's narratives, where biological connection continues to rule the imaginary. Indeed, Turner and Coyle found that a feeling of genetic discontinuity, i.e. disruption in the continuity of donor offspring's identity as a biological product of both their parents, was very common amongst all their participants in their study. Now, such discontinuity, one might argue, matters only when one assumes it to have an effect that is different from having genetic continuity. And there's a whole lot of work to be undertaken around this, because a lot of issues that come up are issues that come up in all sorts of families under all sorts of circumstances. For example, disenchantment with the birth family, genetic or not, very common, especially amongst teenagers. But often donor offspring do not see it as something that is part of that process. They see it as specifically related to the fact that they are donor offspring. And we know, and again, Claire has talked about this, so I don't want to talk about this too much, but you know, there is a common sort of acceptance now that we're looking at a kind of notion of the notion of the possibility of isolating specific genomic variants as responsible for the complexities of the gene-type environment interaction are unlikely. So that, Meany argues, at the level of biology, there are no genes for intelligence, depression, fashion sense, and so on and so forth. Okay. However, this position contrasts significantly with donor offspring's accounts of themselves, such as Rachel, who says, "I'd like to know about my donor's history. Health. Half of my health history is missing and missed. I'd like to see the personality traits I've inherited. It'd be fun to recognize them in my donor father. We'd probably have a lot in common, have a closeness that I didn't have with my parents." Now, I want to quickly sum up, because I'm getting to the end. There's been a very interesting study that's currently underway in Victoria in Australia. Victoria in Australia was the place that first put an end to donor anonymity in 1988. And they have been contemplating this year changing the legislation around donor anonymity to enable also people who were conceived before 1988, when the change was made, to get access to their parents' information. The Victoria Health Authority was tasked with doing a study with any of the donors they could find, and they found 42, to find out what they thought about it. And lo and behold, the majority were not willing to have their details disclosed. In other words, these parents did not see themselves as having a parental connection and did not feel the fact that there was a biological connection as an imperative to develop other kinds of connection. So they haven't actually gone ahead at the moment with changing the legislation. I'm just going to go to my last paragraph. I want to suggest that epigenetics in this context actually holds a certain liberatory potential. And I'm very aware that epigenetics can be read conservatively, as we must regulate mothers because all sorts of things can happen. And it can be read in another way, which is to say the very fact that genes do not matter in the way in which we imagine actually allows us to start moving away from the notion that genetics is determining, and therefore from the notion that knowing the biological background will tell you inevitably about yourself. So, Margaret Locke says, quite simply, genes are not us. And I would say that epigenetics liberates us from the overvaluing of genetic ties. They do not matter as much as we think they do. Understanding this may help donor offspring come to terms with their origins more readily, since it queries the genetic determinism that fuels their imaginary. Second, it liberates women from overvaluing genetic connection, which is hugely important for those who use assisted reproduction. It suggests a genuinely new figuration of the female subject, not determined by reproduction, where the maternal becomes a sociocultural rather than a genetic entity. The question and the trick is how to change cultural perceptions of genetic to bring them more in line with current developments in epigenetics.
Very much, Gabriele.
Okay, do excuse my voice, because I have a cough.
So thank you very much, Gabriele, and we'll move on to our last paper now, and this is Ruth Cain, who is this working? Ruth Cain, who is in law at Kent, and her title is Risk, Choice and the Toxic Womb, Obesogenic Maternal Behaviour and the Rhetoric of the New Degeneration.
I actually changed it.
Sorry, you've changed it.
It's interesting that I did change it. I changed it to eugenics, and this is called the published version that I'm about to try to get published. Out of interest, they have picked up on this word and said, well, you can't use that. You know, because this is about the Nazis. I was actually told this is about something terrible that's happened in the past, and if you're going to use this word, you've really got to contextualise it very well. You know, so this is an interesting point to note for what I'm about to say, because I think it's absolutely clear that we're looking at a very persistent long-term discourse, and I'm sure Clare would agree with me. She's actually written an entire book on this. So anyway, on with the paper. I'm looking really at refigurations of maternal risk to child health, and I've restricted it in this case to the debate on childhood obesity. And so I wanted to look at the idea of what, you know, Ian Hacking would call the making up of a particular type of subject, or the kind of the way that subjects become embodied socially and culturally through these images that we created them, often politically, but also through things like comedy and through common cultural parlance. So you will probably be familiar with this idea of parents, and particularly women, who basically create obese children in and out of the womb, and thus engender this supposed public health crisis that we're apparently now going through. And there's an awful lot of literature on this, popular scientific, medical, government literature, which takes a really quite gothic tone about the future of public health in the affluent West. And I think that within that kind of effective economy, these certain types of abject, dangerous body come to actually substitute for real social actors and agents. So you end up with a kind of avatar. You know, this bad, fattening mother becomes a sort of literally embodied. And I don't know if any of you have read the paper by Imogen Tyler, The Chav Mum. I think it's a similar kind of, some of you may have read that already. It's in Studies in the Maternal a few years ago. And she talks about how, in fact, the Chav Mum's now become a recognisable figure, even though it's very hard to identify who she actually is. Through a certain set of characteristics, such as clothing, also body size, frequently, the way that she talks, she now exists as a real person who can be put on screen in something like Little Britain, and everyone will go, oh yeah, we've met her, we've seen her. Do you see what I mean? So I'm talking really about how this phantom sort of embodiment comes into place through various different types of literatures and forms of regulation. So I think as well, I have to mention here the austerity agenda, because I think we're going to see an acceleration of this kind of regulatory production of bad subjects, and we already are, you know, in poverty discourse, welfare reform discourse. We've had a huge intensification post the bank bailout out of this rhetoric of undeserving poverty, particularly poverty relieved by the state. So Tracy Jensen talks about this new politics of tough love. You've got this rosy vision of the post-war family, which everybody was thrifty, and also everyone was slim and didn't eat a lot, and I think this is very important. There's this idea that the poor are currently wasteful, and that this waste is also embodied in their bodies as obesity. So we have this very strongly identified with the working class mother, and I think we now have to also call her the workless mother, because what is working class, and this is a whole other paper, is now very problematic, isn't it? What do we have left as a working class when the so-called social residuum no longer work, or are seen to be dependent on the state? So, and I just really want to look at how, you know, this whole complex of governance, as Nicholas Rose would call it. You're cutting experience in specific ways, and you're cutting people up in particular ways, and I think that this embodiment of the fat mother is a very fine example of that. Okay, so... And I do think as well that I will be banging on repeatedly in this paper about this neoliberal emphasis on personal responsibility. And I think that this very strongly refigures eugenic ideas, because the responsibility of the mother in particular is to produce a child which is of good quality. So we sort of substituted this idea of national fitness, which used to be, it used to be possible to talk about national fitness, about mothers breeding children for the empire or for the state or for the army. You can no longer do this. You can only talk about their personal responsibility to produce a decent citizen. And I think this is particularly important, and this is why I use the word eugenics, because I don't think that you can separate eugenic discourse from this at all. So, looking at the Anglophone countries in particular, because obviously some of you may be able to tell me what's going on in Europe in this sort of area, but I think we have a particular issue with this in Anglophone countries, the UK, USA in particular, which has the highest obesity rates, and Australia. These are the countries coming out with the most punitive policies and also the most kind of cultural anxiety about obesity. They also tend to conceptualize it more as a purely personal risk. So I also think we've got to talk about mothers here, because you get gender-neutral parents addressed in health advice and in the law, but they're always basically female. When you look at what that gender-neutral parent is doing, it is all the tasks of mothering, feeding, nurturing, the basic undervalued tasks. So this is where we get to epigenetics, and Claire's given a much more complex scientific definition of it that I can give. You've already had the definition, which is useful because I didn't have a very good one. But I'm looking at how pregnancy and the period before conception are construed as this foundation of health and intelligence throughout life. So irresponsible maternal behaviour during pregnancy threatens this apparently irreversible damage. And you will already have heard of fetal alcohol syndrome, crack cocaine ingestion. I think that the discourse of obesity is very closely related to these panics about the poisoning of generations of children. And the creation of a bio-underclass, these American theorists, actually I believe they're Canadian, Litton McNeil, have talked about the bio-underclass associated very strongly with poor maternal behaviour, which creates a damaged class and is associated with antisocial behaviour, for instance, and the breakdown of the state. In the USA, this is also a very racialized discourse, but less so here, and I believe less so in Australia as well. Okay. So, and of course, the obesogenic mother who fattens up her child is very ambiguously situated, I think, in the bio-underclass, because she's not actually using any drug. She is taking in an everyday substance, food, which is germane to maternal work and identity. So somehow, through her very active nurture, she poisons her child. And so I think that she illustrates this blurring that we have of criminality with negligence in parenting, this obsessively feared abuse of children, which can now happen whatever you do. Any neglect can now be abuse. And we also see this more ambiguous cultural fear of indulgence and irresponsibility in all areas of life, particularly when it comes to children. And the regulatory regimes involved in policing this tend to be targeted at the lower end. So I will mention later that the higher classes, if we can call them that, the middle class and above of mothers tend to be targeted through these regimes of information, fear, anxiety, warnings, whereas the actual punitive interventions will be occurring at what they would call the lower level. Cameron's 170,000 problem families who must be regulated, those who were targeted by antisocial behaviour orders, for instance. They will be the people who will be given parenting orders and told, improve your child's diet or else, or get your child to school. So that's where we're looking at the, the real proper regulatory intervention. But it affects everyone because it creates a regime in which that certain behaviour will be policed, and if not policed, looked down on very heavily. Okay. There are very few charges, actual abuse charges made regarding obesity in children, but they have been made, including in this country. I'll mention some of those if I have time later, but won't go into too much detail about them. So, and I think that the kind of evidence that Clare and Gabriele have already talked about in terms of epigenetics plays a very important regulatory role here. And so we've now got we've already been told about how toxic, a lot of underclass type habits are, and underclass in inverted commas of course, such as smoking and, taking street drugs. We have a long literature already on how damaging this is. We've now got this kind of genetic stigmata, I think you can almost call it, of programming your fetus in the wrong way. So this concept of epigenetic deterioration through generations, it obviously provides evidence, as we've seen, that inadequate mothering in terms of both care, as in the rodent studies, insufficient licking, insufficient nurture, and nutrition create these genetic flaws that can then be transmissible through generations in the future. And we've seen the enormous cultural valency of genetic discourse in the West, so it offers this kind of inarguable narrative of degeneration, I think. You've got Dr. Sears, the title of my paper, This Growing Genetic Disaster. It's Dr. Sears, who's this online American health guru, who talks about a disaster coming to America and the Western countries because mothers aren't eating enough omega-6 and 9. They're not balancing out their fatty acids. So you see, so this flaw in the diet of the Western mother will create a generation of inadequate, stupid, You know, he's talking about intelligence. See, it's eugenics writ large, is it not? But with this inarguable sort of scientific evidence. Because a scientist said this, so therefore, you know it's right. You must rely on this. It also, I mean, it obviously polices women because maternal attention to correct nutrition now has to begin, I mean, not even before conception. Any woman who is a potential mother should have been feeding herself properly throughout life, and also her own mother should have done the same. So the class implications are quite clear here, aren't they? Certain people have been brought up better, will produce better children. Well, eugenics again. So, and I think it creates this anxiety, this idea that the maternal body is a sort of toxic substance that must be rigidly controlled. It's an old idea, it goes throughout law, literature, whatever, but it's shared to these varying degrees by women across the social spectrum. And obviously at the top of the social hierarchy, women have the resources to construct these demanding strategies for perfecting your child, which are educational and also dietary. You know, the alpha mother, which is something I'm writing about in another project, who micromanages her child's life and diet to produce a perfect citizen. Okay, so these kind of educated, responsible citizens, they have to differentiate themselves from this doomed underclass that we're always being told about, the feckless. And so if you produce a child of lowered quality, it's now seen as a sort of materialisation of risk, isn't it? You know, you've not managed the risk that is implicit in being a mother, therefore you have been punished with, a child of poor quality. And Ellie Lee talks about this being sin. You know, you've sinned in some way, therefore you will be punished for your inadequacy, and it's a moral concern, And so I think this is, the familiar rhetoric of degeneration, which Max Nordau was talking about in the 19th century, it's always implicated mother in this feminising and weakening of national strength, which is conceived of as masculine and also military. See, now that we're no longer directly a military nation, we're not talking about military fitness so much, but I think the idea of national fitness is now it's about productivity, isn't it? It's about economic productivity. And so degeneration is now associated with, unsustainable health expenditure, unsustainable criminal justice expenditure and welfare expenditure on this social residuum. And also with lowered national competitiveness in this global race we're always being told about. And so you have this very complex layered governance of these materializations of risk, and you get what David Winnicott calls this regulatory science. It puts the scientific evidence into these political useful forms, which the courts can then disseminate, which the government can then disseminate. Child protection officers will be aware that, a child of a certain weight should possibly be removed from its parents, because, it's that level at which danger signals become clear and obvious, which perhaps would not have been in another decade. You probably also have heard of this debate on infant feeding, breastfeeding. I'm not going to go into too much, which references very similar fears of malnutrition, lazy mothering, insufficient attention. Mass failure to breastfeed is supposedly creating a population of lowered intelligence and disease resistance, and also higher body weight over life. So again, maternal failure, produces obesity. So I think you come up with an image of this mother as both just extremely dangerous. This maternal figure is massively nationally and politically dangerous, but she's also completely privately responsible. No one is going to help her. So this is the thing that really becomes striking when you research this area. Because our Western societies are so devoted to freedom of consumer choice and also corporate choice to sell whatever they like to the masses, the only person who is empowered to regulate the child is the mother. So she must fend off this kind of onslaught of marketing or whatever, which no one is actually going to do anything about. Obviously, there are various governmental approaches to this, but on the whole, laissez-faire has been the movement, I think particularly under the UK coalition as it stands. Okay, so I just wanted to mention this idea of the obesity epidemic. The World Health Organization issued this global health warning back in 1997, that obesity should now be regarded as one of the greatest neglected public health problems of our time. You might be surprised to hear that it's neglected, given the amount of verbiage which is now generated around it. And so then at this point there was this general moral panic, and the idea of obesity as of a disease as moral irresponsibility as well as biological decline. But as I've mentioned, we live in economies pretty much entirely geared to the practice of consumption, so it's unsurprising both that there is obesity and also that there's no real intervention in the supply side factors that influence it, like misleading labelling, aggressive marketing, you know what I'm talking about, cheap bulk ingredients, all these things which are connected to the increasing weight of the Western population. And so you see this really incredibly useless and toothless focus on information, which is supposed to facilitate individual lifestyle change. I don't know if you've seen the Change for Life campaign, which is pretty much all that the current government are doing to combat obesity, is to provide pretty coloured posters in doctor's surgery saying eat 4 portions of fruit and vegetables a day, etc., and reduce your fat and sugar. I think that the other regulatory format, other than direct interventions, is shaming and punishing. I am meant to cut it out because I think it's going to take too long. But you've seen those programs, Honey, I fattened up the kids. What's it called? You know that one where they put pictures of the children extended into adulthood, and if the children are eating too much, you would show the picture of a gracefully overweight adult, for instance, and the parents would have a shot of the parents going, the shame of having produced an inadequate and fat child. And it's like this kind of, Henry Giroux calls it the neoliberal theatre of cruelty, where the inadequate subject will be punished for its faults. And in parenting terms, this is happening more and more. There was a particular spike in that in the Blair era, I think, when there was a particular focus on correct parenting behaviour. Okay. So anyway, in terms of direct protective interventions for childhood obesity, this was in fact established practice in the UK in the 2000s, but you don't get many actual prosecutions of parents. It may, however, come into a sort of, it may be one factor in a neglect prosecution, a decision to remove a child. So some reports I was looking at, there was a case in Cornwall where a morbidly obese boy was fostered, and the judge made comments in a newspaper about how successful it had been, because following the fostering the boy had lost a huge amount of weight. There was no reference to whether he missed his mother or that the separation might have been traumatic for him. Do you see what I mean? So success was measured in terms of his body weight. There's also, and this ties in completely to the television point, a Dundee family with 7 children, with 6 were classed as obese, and they were actually monitored by Dundee Council in a Big Brother house where they were continually filmed to see whatever they were eating. And because they would do, it is astonishing, isn't it? The amount of money that must have gone into this as well from the council, I find it shocking. But anyway, there was a 3-year period in which this intensive surveillance took place. They were judged not to have been feeding the children correctly, particularly the older children who were helping themselves to the wrong kind of food, and 4 of the children were removed and subsequently adopted. So you can see that highly punitive interventions do take place. Okay. So what I also wanted to mention very briefly, because I only have 5 minutes, is to expand a bit more on this 2-tier responsibilisation. Whereas, if you are a socially deprived person, you will manifest that failure as a stigmatised or criminalised individual failure. See, you've got good and responsible parenting in the austerity context, positioned as this alternative to a pampering state, which you'll hear the right talk about a great deal. That's a condition presented as kind of undermining the will necessary to exercise your personal responsibility and bring up responsible children. The state, however, is not responsible. The recent white paper from the Department of Health says that the state is not responsible for restricting the supply of fattening foods or even regulating it. We cannot do this. This would be a completely unfair restriction of choice. Therefore, the responsibility must be referred back to the individual in almost every case. And this is particularly, the Blair government were less like that, the coalition government much more so, much more understandably attached to politics of laissez-faire. So, but I find this pampering discourse quite fascinating, because you're also seeing it in other areas like exposure to online activity. You've had a government advisor saying, that parenting babies children, this kind of parenting, it babies the child permanently but also fails to manage the true risks. You get this idea of a kind of monstrously out of control offspring, this kind of tyrant who enslaves the parent, who's terrified of refusing them anything. And I think pampering discourse, I think it represents a very complex response to consumer capitalism. It's like, we know that self-indulgence is what our economy is all about, and yet to manifest self-indulgence, particularly as a mother, is obscene in this culture. So it's like the indulgence in food is this excessively visible marker of consumption. It goes against what Susan Bordeaux has noted as this privileging of the slender body, which, contradictorily to the society it's in, controls itself, reduces its intake, and demonstrates slimness. So it's saying, well, I consume, I am rich, but I am also slim. Therefore, whatever excess I manifest is classy. It is valued. Do you see what I mean? And you have Stuart Hall, criminologist, talking about the infantile narcissism of advanced consumer capitalism. It's this denial of the fact that continual consumer enjoyment will have deleterious effects, and probably on the body. And so the obese child kind of manifests this failure of capitalism to do its subjects any good, let's be frank. I think also the weak parent I think is representing this kind of failed superego in advanced consumer capitalism. It's the term that Zizek uses. He says that what's happening in consumer capitalism is that instead of saying stop, prohibiting, the superego now says enjoy, you must enjoy. And so this self-indulgent pregnant woman who's programming this fat fetus to become a fat adult, she's obeying the imperatives of capitalism. She's doing the right thing in some ways. She's buying and she is consuming, and she's bringing up a little consumer. But at the same time, she is personifying this kind of dangerous, de-prohibiting function of consumer culture. So she provides this way to kind of sidestep this contradiction. You can blame her. You know, it's like saying we're not going to think about consumerism, what it actually means for the individuals that must live it. What we will do is put a face on it. You know, Lauren Ballant talks about facialization. She says that in every issue that a face will be slapped on it. This is a bad mother. Here you are. You know, and so she can be criticised when the kind of overarching structures may not. Just to finish, I was thinking of, I don't know if you remember the fetal ASBO, that it was called the fetal ASBO, I don't think he called it that the Tony Blair wanted to bring in. He wanted to intervene from the first pregnancy in families already defined as high risk for antisocial behaviour, low educational achievement and critically poor health. And I'm sure obesity would have been one of the factors in that. And I think, in effect, you know, you can criticise Blair all you like, but these plans kind of make consummate neoliberal sense, don't they? Because you have this consensus that poor mothers, they're unable to navigate the choices necessary for a good consumer. They can't create a high-quality child. Well, Blair government wanted to help them. You know, he wanted to help them do it better by direct intervention. So I think you can see that how this maternal overfeeding in and out of the womb, it kind of carries all these awkward contradictions of self-indulgence and consumerism. And we then get them projected onto this obese maternal body who embodies this abject low-class excess, working-class excess, work-class excess. And of course, in the post-austerity context, this symbolism has even greater force. So I would basically call the obesogenic mother a kind of effective embodiment of this disavowed cultural excess of consumption. And so when you regulate her, when you shame her, and also when you punish her, this becomes cathartic and very symbolically useful for us all. This is why she's such an important figure. She's not only provided this new object of contestation to organise debates about gender, reproduction and the underclass, but she's, I would say, an avatar for these reinvigorated fears of feminisation, weakening and degeneration that we can't possibly separate from the history of eugenics. Which, at that point, opening that can of worms, I will stop.
I'll just use it for the moment. Thank you so much. I think that was absolutely fascinating panel, and all the papers work so well together. And especially sort of, in a way, you set up the whole debate about epigenetics and you know, whether it's conservative or liberal, and how it can be so enabling, and enabling us to reconceptualize different parental paradigms, and although maybe there's also an erasure going on at the same time, and then how we've got the political manipulation of it being used to blame mothers yet again for being toxic or whatever. And also a couple of things I thought sort of came out, particularly perhaps in the first two papers, but I'm just wondering whether, you know, maybe that can also be useful for your case, was the role and the importance and the role of narrative and story and language. You know, there's sort of a need to reinvent language to express those different relationships and perhaps different possibilities of it. So we can open it up to questions. So, right, loads, they go. If you can manage the microphone so that whoever needs to speak gets it. It should be working, just speak closely.
Okay. This is a question for Gabriele. I thought I was really interested in what you said, and you sounded quite sort of critical of this very heavy genetic determinism. And to a certain extent, developments in science and things are starting to eat away at that. But what strikes me as really odd and ironic, and I wondered if you could comment on this, is that, of course, those parents that seek donor sperm have invested hugely in the idea of genetics and genetic reproduction. And of course, as we know, that genes aren't everything, but sociocultural things are, they pass on those values, not genetically, but socioculturally to their children. So in a sense, it's like a little capsule where those overvalued ideas about genetics are self-perpetuating. And how do you deal with that if the rest of society is sort of getting to grips with it? Those people maybe specifically aren't, and they're the ones that almost more need to.
Is this working? Yeah, this is working. Well, I think you're absolutely right that in certain ways they overinvest, although you also have increasingly now, of course, scenarios where the genetic connection is multiply mediated. So that, for example, if you have a woman carrying a donated egg and donated sperm for a gay couple, the genetic connection is an illusio, if you like, if it was ever there. What is very interesting is that in the regulation of the processes, and this is where, in a way, it ties in with Ruth's paper, is the way in which public regulation mobilizes these developments to reproduce ideas about genetic connection as being key to social formations, so that, for example, all manner of difference is eradicated. You know, the whole debate about whether you should have cross-racial adoption or not, the question about whether, you know, how and in what ways age matters, class matters, you know, all those sorts of things. To me, there is a very, very, very interesting movement going on, which is a movement, maybe the wrong word there, but which ties directly into your paper, which is that we're having particular kinds of discourses which are being mobilized and reproduced in certain scenarios for particular forms of governmentalities, if you like. And part of what it seems to me, as feminists, we might want to do is actually seek to intervene in those and seek to start to argue with those, because the other side of it, if we don't offer other ways of reading, is that you get, in a sense, overrun by these kinds of discourses, which, to horrifying degrees sometimes, if you think things around issues such as fetal rights, become legal realities that we are then regulated by in ways that become very hard to undo.
I have a comment that it bears most directly on both Clare's and Gabriele's paper, but all three papers demonstrate something, which is the absolute cultural authority of science. And we're told, you know, now we can learn from epigenetics that what makes us what we are is not just our DNA, and that identity is more important to that. And it's so profoundly depressing that this is what people in the humanities have been saying for years. We don't need to look to epigenetics for this model, because it's the model that we've been, that so many of us in the humanities have assumed for years. And it's as if now, or at last, the sciences come to confirm what the humanities have been saying. But the depressing thing about it is it's like saying, we may as well not have been saying all these things in the humanities for all these years. We don't have any effect. We don't have any effect at all. The only thing that can possibly have an effect is when we discover a scientific model that is a bit like the one that we've all had. And feminists have been saying, ever since I can ever remember, you know, it's not all about genetics. It's, do you see what I mean? There's something very depressing about
Sorry.
it.
I really want to come in on that, because I think obviously it's very difficult to explain epigenetics. It's extremely difficult to explain it, and obviously I didn't do it adequately. But what the point about epigenetics is not that it reinforces the idea that everything is culturally constructed. It seems to me that one of the problems we've had is well, there are all sorts of problems, but there has been for many decades this standoff between the sciences promoting biological explanations of characteristics and the humanities arguing that things are culturally constructed. Epigenetics actually is so ambivalent, it strikes me, because one of the things it does, it doesn't say it's all cultural. It absolutely precisely does not say that. Epigenetic research undoes that kind of opposition. It shows that it's a false opposition which rests on fictive entities, both cultural
constructivist thought is a fiction, as is the absolutely biological.
Yeah, but it's a misrepresentation of feminism in the humanities to say it's always argued that everything is culturally constructed.
That's true.
There's a certain
That's true.
stream that's argued that, but there's tons of feminists.
But can I just finish what I said? Because I really think I haven't communicated what I want to say. Sorry, but it seems
here.
Well, the problem is that epigenetics brings back the biological in ways which it seems to me. And I don't believe that science is true, but the science, as it is being articulated, is suggesting at one and the same time that we can change, quote unquote, our genes, that it's possible to intervene to make a better world. And on the other hand, that it isn't, because you are landed with the environment you've got. And that environment from the womb onwards determines who you are. And it seems to me those are the stakes, really. Does that make sense? Sorry, I realise I've caricatured feminism, but it seems to me it's really crucial to kind of highlight the biological.
Can I also raise a supplementary point here? And this is that we have seen since the 90s a re-scientization of culture in a really problematic way. And I think part of this is not about, oh, let's find a scientific paradigm that confirms something that we think or know, but it is also about trying to engage with these discourses that have become incredibly dominant in our culture and trying to think about ways in which we can, in a sense, start to own them more. Because I think it's very difficult, or it's problematic, if we don't engage with them because they're so determining and from within, dare I say, our own ranks in some contexts. So, that's my supplementary.
Very quick. Okay. Very, very quick. I think maybe I was thinking it's kind of like the geneticization of culture in some ways, isn't it? Epigenetic discourses. For instance, it ratifies things like attachment theory. This whole rat licking study, John Bowlby he's obviously had a significant influence, but had been somewhat superseded. And now you're bringing back this idea that, in fact, yes, that lack of maternal presence, for instance, will result in genetic deterioration. So I agree. I find it very hard to separate the two, and what worries me is it's the way that it will be deployed is the worrying way. The political deployment is what is extremely frightening because it now has the authority of science. You can say that bad mothering will produce, and bad mothering being cultural and structural in many ways, it produces an underclass. It reproduces the underclass. Anyway.
Well, I suppose I should have said this before you answered, because I was about to say that it seems to me that this epigenetics is actually transferred constructivism of a certain kind, however, to biology, or to an earlier stage in the individual's life, i.e., before the individual is even born. So it seems to me that on one side we are here giving the individual some agency, because there is a part of the genetic, if we can still use that word, makeup of the individual, a freedom where some areas actually interact with other areas, and so there is that possibility or potential for creating one's own self. However, basically we are finding a genetic, or rather biological basis for things that we said all the time, and that is the bad mothers, or mothers that behave or eat certain things that affect the children. So that has always been said. We weren't waiting for epigenetics to tell us, but now we have even a stronger biological base for that. But where, my question would have been, before you answer that, where is actually agency? Because constructivism is just as bad as essentialism in not giving us, an ability to change anything. And so what kind of, and now in a way I'm going back to Gabriele's paper, because she does seem some element of liberation there from biology. So where does the agency begin? Because we're talking about really the first stages in the life of a person, but when does consciousness kicks in, and how free are we within this new framework to really construct ourselves? Sorry for, I don't know. I know that you're probably not an expert in epigenetics, as you know, and I don't expect you to answer for it, but maybe from books that you have read, and also the text, the narratives, whether there is somewhere a sense that there is a liberatory, I don't know the right word here, potential there. Sorry, a bit long.
Well, no. What you're saying really picks up on something that's been going through my mind during the panel, which it seems to, these papers have brought into really sharp relief that one of the real problems about epigenetics, and I absolutely take your point about the way in which science has such cultural authority and the way in which it's used, really determines what kind of set of beliefs and ideologies we kind of practice in our most personal lives and our most intimate kind of formations. Absolutely take that point. But I think one of the things that throws into really sharp relief is the kind of exactly the rhetoric of agency and the fact that on the one hand we're given this, we're force-fed the rhetoric of choice, which of course does not mean choice, absolutely does not mean choice, because nobody makes individual choices in that way. And on the other hand, the thing that is not coming into public view is the fact that if you think about epigenetics and you think about environments, that is eminently a social question. It is an absolutely social and political question. People grow up in environments which are not toxic because of the womb, because they grow up in a toxic area of town where you know, their lives and the lives of their children and grandchildren will be affected by that situation. The science indicates that. The scientists kind of gesture on the margins. There are little kind of final sentences that say, a la Rots and Crick, it has not escaped our notice that, you know, this might kill everybody. You know, it's kind of there, but nobody's picking it up. Nobody's kind of picking it up, and nobody's kind of really, as Gabriele says, nobody's interrogating the scientists. You know, that's... Sorry.
I would also say we live in an age where the rhetoric of choice notwithstanding, we experience ourselves as having diminished agency. And you see that in things like what is known as the democratic deficit, for example. You see that in ways in which people find it hard to engage politically because they do no longer think they are effective. So I think there's one really interesting question to be asked about how do people think about agency and what does it mean in an age when, you know, your average punter, if there is such a thing, is not taking to the streets anymore, is not feeling able to do certain things, but nonetheless there is resistance. There is resistance. When you look around, when you look at, for example, narratives of sort of divergent families about their formations, there's a huge range of diversity from people who are seeking desperately to conform to a certain idea. So they must all look alike. They won't talk about where they come. I mean, the most recent studies on how many people disclose that they've used assisted reproduction are frightening. The vast majority of people still do not tell the children that they were conceived with assisted reproduction, even now. But there are, on the other hand, family formations where it's different and where people do produce a narrative that is very consciously about resisting certain forms of enforced normatization. And I think it's interesting to look at where are those things happening in a context where in the political arena often people do not feel very able to take action. But oddly enough, around, for example, changing specific laws, they do in many countries. You have interest groups that say we want to change how X is regulated and who with relatively small numbers are affecting that. So I think there's something interesting going on around agency, and it is not as people would have thought about it, let's say, in the 70s or early 80s. You know, it's a very different field.
Very quickly, it interests me when you mention agency, because I do think there is some political deployment of this kind of concept, but it is restricted to personal responsibility. So in fact, you have the poor being expected to demonstrate more agency in terms of overcoming the barriers that they face. They will be given, you know, the idea that if you are responsible, if you are ambitious, you can claw your way out of this background. You know, and that narrative still exists, the kind of Protestant work ethic. It reminds me of, you know, how in fact the religious impulse to work was deployed in earlier centuries, where people were working 14, 15-hour days in the factories, and were told that this was a route to virtue. So I think we need to look at what the modern virtues are as well, and how that's being deployed in a genetic sense. Somehow, as a mother, you will manifest your virtue in a better child. And this is why what Ellie Lee says about sin really interests me, is the sense that to neglect your personal responsibility is the new definition of sin, and you will receive your punishment in this world for that. So I do think there is a form of agency being deployed which is in fact somewhat destructive and highly controlling. What we are lacking is, you know, agency in the 1970s sense, I believe, the agency to change institutions and to overcome the kind of rhetoric that we're being given. So.
Okay, thanks. I think we've got time for one more question. So behind Alice. Okay. No, sorry, we go. Fight between you.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Thank you for the wonderful papers. My question was to do with language, and it reminded me of the points you're making reminded me of going to a postgraduate symposium run by medical students, medical researchers. And I was the only humanities postgraduate in the room. And one of the speakers was explaining her research about getting women to take folic acid when they were pregnant and before they conceived. And the term that she used was compliance. And that kind of set me bristling. But she didn't mean it in the way that I received it, I think, because she kind of meant it in a, oh, isn't this great, this works, we should encourage women to take it. But it was that language that really bothered me, and I was wondering whether you had any comments about that.
I have many, because I teach medical law, but I can restrain them from it. Right, well, I could go on for a long time about this. Yeah, there's actually a book written, I forget the author, I will try and find it for you, Judgments of Non-Compliant Women in Pregnancy, because there's a term that's very frequently used. And yeah, there's a whole regime in which, you know, one must comply, and if you don't tick the boxes, if you don't turn up for the scans, for instance, that will then mobilise a certain set of social actors to come and watch over what's happening to your child. So there is a legal element to it, there is a kind of sub-legal element from which you will be perhaps excluded from certain benefits if you don't partake of the correct regime. And at the class level, well, I think any of you who've had children here know how much you are expected to comply with. There are certain social expectations of certainly women in the middle class, that they do not smoke, that they do not drink, that they will have drinks taken out of their hands, perhaps, should they reach for one. I remember once when I was pregnant standing next to a diesel emitter next to a hamburger stand and being physically moved away from it. You know, it's that sense that your body is no longer your own, and you will therefore conform to a set of rules which you have not been asked about. You know, these come from those judging compliance or otherwise. So, and I think this ties into fetal rights. Did you mention that, Gabriele? It ties into a whole raft of pretty appallingly oppressive movements to restricting the bodies of women, which I found extremely disturbing. And it begins at that level. I think doctors, unfortunately, do have a great deal to answer for when they, you know, tick boxes and call certain women compliant and others not. I do have, you know, doctor friends. Yeah, exactly. They say, oh, we don't mean that. We just mean that, you know, we're trying to help. But when trying to, as I've said in terms of the fetal ASBO, you know, when trying to help becomes a form of control, then you have really lost what it means to assist a person in their pregnancy. You have anything else to say?
I think it raises a couple of points for me. One is about, well, it's about interdisciplinarity and the problems of interdisciplinarity. I think Ruth's absolutely right. There's a whole language which is used in the NHS. There's an elaborate language, particular vocabulary, particular verbs and nouns are used, like compliance. And then, as you said, they're not intended to have the kind of implication. The discourse is generated without thought to the common sense implications of the words, or the common meanings of the words. That's one thing about medicine, and it comes up very acutely when you talk to medical researchers. But I think there's another underlying and much deeper problem, which is that the language of science itself, more generally, and in this case biological science, the language that is used, scientists use everyday language as kind of placeholders to kind of describe phenomena which are poorly understood. But there is very little thought given to the kind of implications of the words in common use. And that creates huge amounts of lots of unintended consequences culturally, and I think that's another really interesting area for investigation, particularly perhaps here in relation to, you know, the construction of the maternal subjectivity and maternal responsibility.
I also think it's about something else. It's about the migration of vocabulary, because the word compliance comes out of the new managerialism, actually. You know, and what we're looking at is the way in which you have migrations of vocabularies to create particular effects that are in fact intended. You know, we use vocabularies to create effects. I don't think we use them thoughtlessly. I agree with you completely that there is a gap between common sense understandings of a lot of vocabularies and how they are used in specific contexts. But the word compliance comes out of the sort of new managerialism and the extent to which you are submitting to certain sorts of regulatory forces. And I think it is very important to be clear of the meaning of this, because it's meant to be theoretically a politically neutral discourse. We're taking it out of a different domain, which is seemingly without a kind of political intent, but it has a very powerful political intent. And I think a sort of resistance to some of these discourses is absolutely critical, you know, because to the extent also that we use them ourselves, we become the perpetuators of certain kinds of normative ways of thinking about how the world should be.
Thank you so much. I think it's been an absolutely fantastic panel. We're going to finish now, and I think there are probably people already eating lunch, so make sure you get out there and get some before it all gets eaten. Thank you very much indeed.